So welcome to another episode of Ask The GrowBot. I'm Jesse Porter with GrowGlide, the Director of Cultivation and Creative Content. Joined as usual by Wil Gonzalez, Director of Marketing and Creative Tech. He's also going to be the GrowBot Wrangler as usual for the episode. And we have the luxury of being joined by Anders Peterson from Pipp Horticulture. If you don't know Anders, we'll give him a second to introduce himself, but I've known Anders for more years than I can keep track of. When I had my hydro shop, we were close by, we would get together, we would smoke, we would talk shop, and we both had a pretty exotic journey in this space, doing a number of different things, from business ownership to facility design to facility management. I really do think Anders is one of the best resources in the entire cannabis community when it comes to a number of different things. If you don't know, check it out, hit him up. But Anders, thanks for joining us, man. I think this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about racking, operational efficiency, dive into airflow, the things that you and I are pretty well versed in, and find some other rabbit holes. But tell the listeners about yourself a little bit, man.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the intro and thanks for having me. I always enjoy getting to speak with you. We go back so many years, like you said, and it's always just a pleasure to spend time with you. You've helped foster me in my career for so long, and it's just a pleasure kind of always being in your circle. So thank you.
Thanks, man.
I'm Anders Peterson. I'm cannabis operations specialist for Pipp Horticulture. I do a little bit of everything. I wear a lot of hats here at the company, but a lot of my day-to-day is working with helping our customers integrate the vertical racking designs with airflow and HVAC design. So taking a kind of holistic approach to how to build the best multi-tier vertical grow room and how to make it perform optimally. I help with some product development on airflow systems and kind of future products. But really at the heart of it, I'm a cannabis nerd through and through, academic background in cell molecular biology. This is all I've ever wanted to do for my entire life, is work in cannabis, and I've luckily had the opportunity to still be in this industry so many years later. Kind of had almost every job title you can think of, from starting off as a trimmer to running extraction labs, dispensaries, cultivation facilities, you name it. So I'm very passionate about this plant and love talking about it. So this is a great opportunity to do it.
Yeah, every time we get together, the hard part is finding something else to interject in between our conversations about cannabis, man. Reality is I think you and I talk about it more than anything else.
Absolutely.
Anyway, let's throw a softball at the GrowBot here and see what happens. I think first thing I want to ask is, so how does, racking design decisions impact, these downstream facility design decisions? You and I have a lot of different experiences in this space, like you mentioned, from being a janitor, a facilitator, and we connected. In this case, we're both in the racking position, and we both try to educate our customers and potential customers on the impacts of these decisions. So I'm curious what the GrowBot has to say about it, and maybe we can unpack a little bit.
Sure. I was pretty impressed. I played around with this prior to coming on this podcast, and I was somewhat impressed by a lot of the responses. It really kind of blew my mind.
Isn't it scary, man? Everyone's going to be able to talk at a high level after they throw some stuff at the GrowBot.
Yeah, and each model gets even better. We're using GPT-4 for this, and that's already leaps and bounds ahead of 3.5 with its accuracy and its responses. So it's only going to get even scarier. Okay, space utilization, lighting.
Obviously, number one, right? Room utilization. You and I talk about cubic room utilization. That's a big hot button for us, really helping people understand how to utilize the space and take in airflow considerations. Lighting, number two, obviously the number of lights in the space, but also the tier-to-tier spacing to optimize the lighting choice. Irrigation is going to be dramatically impacted. What kind of media are we choosing? How are we getting the appropriate amount of water to the appropriate tiers? Environmental controls, that's a podcast in its own, talking about conventional, non-integrated, integrated HVAC. Labor, obviously something that we consider when we're talking about single tier, double tier, triple tier, load in, default, access IPM. And then number six, scalability and flexibility, right? Like okay, do we build, and this is a great one for phasing, right? Like, do we build 2 tiers out the gate, 3 tiers out the gate? Do we do a single tier and add to it later? But I guess let's go back up to number 1 and just sort of unpack from there. I think room utilization, space utilization is a huge one. I feel like it strongly directly ties to operational efficiency. I'd love to hear your take.
Well, first of all, can you just copy and paste and send this to me so I can have the marketing department throw it out as a blog? Because I'm pretty impressed by this response. It's pretty spot on.
If this thing had a voice, they would be in sales.
Oh man, I think it pulled from the Grow Glide and Pipp Horticulture blog postings to put this together. It's pretty funny. Yeah, space utilization is obviously, I'm glad that it put it as number 1, because at the end of the day, that's what mobile vertical racking is about, is utilizing the space of these commercial buildings to its utmost potential. Single tiered grow rooms have been built for decades, right? Throughout Prohibition, first with stationary aisles, right? And then slowly, as legalization was adopted across the country, we started pulling from traditional greenhouse and other horticulture designs. And then we got single tier rolling benches, which helped increase the surface area, room utilization from 50% or below with stationary benches to up to 80% with single tier rolling benches. But most of these commercial buildings have 20-30 foot ceilings in some of them, right? And there's all of this space that's just wasted, and that's where the vertical farming kind of theory really began, to utilize that space and produce more revenue per square foot. And it really wasn't feasible until high efficiency LEDs were, really developed and adopted by cannabis growers specifically, where they could put out the quantity of light and quality of light that produced the product quality we wanted. And so that's really cool to me, is that the trajectory of vertical farming in cannabis specifically has kind of paralleled the path of LED horticultural lighting. And it's allowed us to utilize space more efficiently, allowed for close proximity lighting, all of it.
I'd like to challenge you real quick. I mean, just out the gates, you know how I'm going to do it, man. Like space utilization, when we talk about this, I talked to Wil about this too. We have our room gen tool on our website that sort of allows you to play around with building racks in your space. And oftentimes the math is, like you said, 50, 75% of room utilization based on square footage. And I challenge that notion that it's more like 25% until you truly consider the height of the space. And then it's like, hey, that single tier is only using 25% of the space, and isn't until you go to 2 tier or 3 tier that you actually get that 75% utilization. Whereas traditionally in the sales environment, we're like, it's 125% room utilization. It's like, no, that's not exactly accurate. I think that's more like talking about pounds per light versus grams per square,
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I've been speaking with some of the folks at Pipp and other colleagues in the space about trying to define these metrics a little bit better around space utilization. So to be honest with you, I don't have a great name for the terms yet. I know how to do the math, but I don't know what to call it really yet. But traditional room utilization is the metric that is discussed. And it's basically just a ratio of bench space to floor space in a single tier perspective. But then some people add the surface area of the benches from all tiers as a ratio to the surface area of the floor. And that's where you get those 150, 200% room utilization figures, right? So it's almost like it's a 2-dimensional and a 3-dimensional room utilization figure. But then that's all area, not volume metrics. And so I feel like there's a whole opportunity for volume metrics like you're talking about, taking into account the area between tiers that occupy the canopy, and really figure that out. And I find the volume utilization really useful in drying rooms as well, to understand, all of that. But what's been interesting to me lately about these metrics for space utilization is how it relates to good airflow and performance. And so it's been really cool to start dialing in on the data to see overutilization, how it can restrict airflow in a room, or what I call choking a room out, basically. And it's there's still more to be learned exactly what numbers are that cutoff in terms of cubic and surface area, but we're going to get there really quickly with how much data combined our companies have of just what is the right space utilization metrics and numbers for a room.
I think you nailed it. Build a business that's fundamentally successful with enough airflow versus the nomenclature of a CFO grow. We are just smashing as much canopy in there as possible to show the numbers, which is great, but you might ultimately choke your performance. Let's unpack number 2 a little bit, right? Like lighting. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this one, but I do think it's important. Something I really like to dive into with people is, when I'm talking to them about racking, I always say, what's your lighting choice? And they say, why does that matter? And, I'll toss it back to you. But for me, it's about understanding light intensity, PPFD on a week-to-week basis, and getting the appropriate tier-to-tier spacing that allows for the light, appropriate airflow, and plant growth to really optimize the space versus thinking, oh, I need 7 feet tier-to-tier because you're a single-tier grower and you're afraid of the transition to multi-tier.
Yeah, the lighting choice it's pivotal, right? After you choose your racking layout and everything, the next step is pick your lighting, and the racking layout determines your lighting count. But and kind of vice versa, they work together in terms of your tier heights and spacing. But light is the number 1 driver of photosynthesis. It is the gasoline in this race car of a grow room, and it's a very important decision. And like you said, the amount of light produced, the PPFD, or what they call it, micromoles per meter squared per second, really dictates the pace at which this room operates. And if you are pumping a lot of light into this room and you haven't provided a room layout or racking layout conducive to allowing for that amount of growth and transpiration and water vapor and all this density of plant growth, you're going to just run into an imbalance type of situation that will prohibit plant growth and be detrimental to your yields at the end of the day. And you also want a lighting choice that's going to give you good coverage over the entire tray and the whole canopy, good penetration.
Right, we're getting away from lighting the room and more into lighting the space and making it mobile and more of an efficiency metric versus let's just cast light everywhere and hope for the best. Number 3,
I have a question for you, if you don't mind, while we're on lighting real quick. There's a hot topic that I've been spending a lot of time looking at, which is the remote ballast thing for lighting. Have you guys looked into this much, and what are your thoughts on locating all the drivers and ballast of these fixtures into a server closet next door? What do you think?
It's a great question, man. I threw the same one at Adrian from Inspire Transpiration Solutions when he was on. And just to unpack it a little bit, he was thinking there's probably a 10 to 15% gain or reduction in the sensible load. So you have a little bit less sensible. But that said, in designing an integrated system, you're still going to have a high transpiration rate. So as you know, you still need a large amount of dehumidification. What I think it does is allows you to play a little bit more with maybe number 4, convective cooling and airflow crop steering and bringing in airflow into the space. Maybe you can use less airflow, more efficient use of energy to still get the same leaf temperatures running a warmer ambient condition, overall increasing your efficiency. Anytime I can eliminate heat from the space, this comes from the ignorant legacy cultivator in me, right? Like if I can get heat out of the space, I'm going to get it out of the space because it means the other tools that I deploy will be more efficient or see a bigger impact immediately. Is that a fair enough response?
Absolutely. I think I'm still curious on like the cost benefit of it, because if you take those ballasts and put them in another room, now that's less space utilization for my facility to grow canopy. I have to dedicate a room for a server room that I could have mounted in my grow room. And for that separate space, I also have to install another HVAC unit to cool it, because regardless of where the heat's generated, it's still generated. And so now, instead of coupling that cooling capacity into my main HVAC unit, now I have to have a whole separate unit to do it. And realistically, as you and I know, when these integrated units are sized, they're sized off the latent load or the dehumidification capacity of the space, which typically can cover then the sensible cooling load. So now I already had that sensible cooling capacity in my integrated unit, and now I have to pay for additional capacity in a server closet. So I'm just curious. it'd be an interesting study to go through and figure out the cost benefit of it. But sorry to get hung up on lighting. I was just doing a deep dive on that thing the other day. So
it's another publication you can attach your name to, man. Change the game, right?
we'll see.
So number 3 kills me, right? Irrigation, right? Irrigation is important. We all know that your racking design is going to impact your irrigation, your fertigation needs, where you take the water and how you get it there. I think plumbing and drainage are also of equal importance to me. How do we get the water out of the room, prevent anaerobic conditions? But every time I see NFT, nutrient film technique, I know that we're drawing information from commercial ag, which is great. I want to lean into commercial ag. But to me, irrigation is like, hey, man, what media choice are we going to use? What are our saturation levels? And what do we need to consider, right? If we're going with soil or deep water culture, that's a tremendous weight load that your racking provider really needs to consider to make sure you have long-term success versus something like rock wool or cocoa that doesn't necessarily need the same weight-bearing considerations.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just nailed it right there in terms of racking considerations for irrigation. That's it. It's how much weight do we have on the racks themselves, and how do we get the water out of the room and off of all the tiers. The drainage is one that's actually kind of interesting to me. It's an important factor of running this room. It makes your day-to-day a lot easier, and just keeps a cleaner environment. But we found that it's actually, I used to recommend installing trench drains in the back of a space, kind of get it out of the way at the end of the tables. But for longer rows, that pitch that you need on your tray, your length of your rows to get it all the way to the back gets really extreme. And so more and more I've found that locating the drains in the middle of the room and pitching both sides in is less of a dramatic pitch to get the water to drain. And it just allows for easier when you're doing cleanup, spraying towards the middle until all the way to the back. So I guess,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I think we could unpack scalability and flexibility and labor requirements and environmental controls. I bet you we get to them in future questions, but quick for labor, right? You and I talk about this a lot. Like, labor is a killer for facilities, whether it's poorly trained labor that doesn't follow SOPs that become the source of pests and pathogens, or labor that just doesn't do the job accurately, or labor that's inefficient. Now, good people that you empower can be incredible. And I think that's where this labor benefit comes into play with multi-tier, right? They're able to attack a room that has more canopy and higher canopy density and really focus on it. And that's a better use value of that trained labor. Would you sort of agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, when you're planning for your racking layout, your facility design, cost of labor should always be considered in that facility design. How far away are these rooms from each other? Where are the tools located to where the process is going to be done? And then things like, if you're planning for a platform catwalk type system, whether it's, Pipps or Grow Glides, think about how many people are going to be in that room. Do you need aisle widths that can accommodate people working on both sides, 2 aisles at once, or a mobile aisle that only accommodates one catwalk system, things like that. And in room design as a whole, there's definitely a breaking point for the overall size of a room and canopy square footage for labor efficiency. I found it to be more successful to size a room's canopy around these labor tasks so that you can complete something within a day. Things like harvesting, things like defoliating. And from talking with you and so many other professionals in the space, I think there's a general consensus of around 2,500 canopy square feet, give or take, as like a good sweet spot for labor efficiency and managing the size of a room,
I guess that said, let's ask the GrowBot another question, right? And let's do it, with some selfish intentions here. It's like, what are the financial benefits of multi-tier indoor cannabis cultivation?
Yeah.
It's going to back some of these up. I think there might be some repetition, but we talk a lot about single tier versus double tier. We had Casey Rivero on, and that's the question he asked the GrowBot, basically challenging this convention that multi-tier is always better. And I think it's a healthy debate on room utilization, the optimization of the tools in the space, labor, all these things. I think you and I are both of the of the theory, though, that in running a lot of facilities, if you're going to run a tight ship, a multi-tier ship is ultimately going to make you more money, be a more profitable asset, and be more valuable in the end as that room utilization cost of production metric becomes more powerful in a compressed market.
I agree. I'm not going to argue with that one.
Energy efficiency.
Increase production capacity.
What is it with nutrient film technique? The GrowBot's got a hot spot for NFT and growing strawberries today.
Yeah, Google loves these like hyped hydroponic terms. I don't know why, or AI, I guess. Energy efficiency. That's
Faster crop
interesting.
turnover? Huh.
They're saying it's more efficient because of choices like LEDs. I guess that's right. I don't know. I think that could be, that's an interesting concept, actually. The energy efficiency of a multi-tier versus, single tier grows if you give it on a canopy by canopy square footage. Truthfully, I don't know the answer yet, but Pipp Horticulture is a member of Resource Innovation Institute, which Jesse, you and I are intimately familiar with. And that's a question I've been posing them, and we're working with to see about, is there an inherent energy efficiency gain by just choosing to go multi-tier in a cultivation business? And there is some interesting data suggests that could be the truth. And the goal is to incentivize multi-tier racking as an infrastructure choice, saying if you go multi-tier, this will inherently improve the energy efficiency of your facility given the production output. And what's cool about it is, you can fit more canopy in a smaller space. So that means the size of all of the motors in the room, like your HVAC and everything, get bigger, which become more efficient. So there's a case right there. Obviously LED lighting. So on a square footage basis, you're using more watts per square foot in a multi-tier room, but you're using those watts more efficiently to produce way more product. Like we always talk about, Jesse, is efficiency is a fraction, right? It's input and output. And you're using more wattage per square foot, but you're getting way more out. So, what's that balance? So that's a really interesting concept, something I want to dive more into myself.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to efficient build out too, that's part of it, right? The cost of building a 2-tier room for the long haul relative to increased production capacity versus a single tier, and then the retrofit cost potentially if you decide to go 2-tier later, adding HVAC, ductwork trunks, all these other complicated aspects. Number 6 jumps out to me though, of faster crop turnover, right? You and I both know that we went one point in our careers at 4 turns a year, then to 5, 5.5. Everyone's striving for 6 pulls a year out of a flower room. Do we necessarily get more turns or faster crop turnover in a multi-tier environment, especially considering people think they need to veg in space in these places because of the lack of environmental control? I think there's a need to apply science and cultivation fundamentals to really take advantage of crop turnover, and it holds true for single tier or double tier.
Yeah, I think that one's a tough one for me to get behind. I think, I don't know, there's a couple ways you can look at it, but I don't know if I totally agree with the faster crop turnover in multi-tier. One of the biggest arguments I could think of is because the plant size is typically smaller in multi-tier, you veg for less length of time. And so you're able to get more cycles through your veg room and hopefully through your flower room. But, the flowering phase of cannabis is genetically determined. And yes, we can speed that up with.
That's more of a spectrum
techniques.
Control conversation, right? Like,
that's just, that's not even inherent to multi-tier. I think what's interesting though, is the trend I've seen is those cultivators who tend to see or to adopt multi-tier tend to be more data driven and not advanced. They're not more advanced, but I would say they're more data driven growers and fine tuning the race car and crop steering and optimizing all of these conditions. And that could lead to a faster turnover, but you can do that on single tier too, realistically.
Right. Different senescence test techniques, different cold air dumps like you and I have talked about, day to night differentials, things that trigger that systemic acquired response in the plant. I'm going to ask something like really specific and see what the Grow Glide has to say. So we're talking about environmental control. We're leading towards airflow, which is going to be a topic I think we're going to unpack next. What is the best supply return configuration for multi-tier indoor cannabis cultivation?
This is going to be interesting.
Right? Because you and I have this conversation a lot. It's different for single tier than double tier. We often talk about sort of a cyclonic action in single tier, get the air moving around. Hopefully it hits the dehumidification. And double tier, there's theories out there that say, hey, let's dump 60% of the air in the front and move it in a semi-laminar fashion towards the back, or space it around, dump it in the center, dump it in the spaces, the mobile aisles in between the racks itself. And it's talking to me about irrigation and nutrient supply.
See, this is an interesting one to ask the GrowBot, because
Yeah.
this is
You're out of your
knowledge
league,
that
GrowBot.
I don't know if this is knowledge that's captured on the internet. This is such technical niche topic that
Yeah.
knowledge lives in heads, like it doesn't live on the internet yet.
So supply return configuration as it relates to what specifically? Do we need to get more?
HVAC.
We need to get more because he's talking about irrigation and
Yeah, I'm thinking specific supply
Yeah.
return for airflow and HVAC.
Yeah.
Because it does play a big pivotal role in the success of a facility, right? And again, it's one of those unknowns and challenges where if you talk to 5 different engineers, you get 5 different perspectives, and you get 5 different white papers, and you get 5 different facilities that are doing it differently with different, gradients of success.
Well, I think an important thing to remember about supply and return ductwork too is what's feasible. There's a big difference between what is ideal and what is affordable or can be installed within the constraints of your building design. So sometimes what the ideal supply and return configurations are, but you just can't install that ductwork in your building's design, unfortunately. The number one thing I always tell people is if you're building a multi-tier room, you should have a purpose-built mechanical system design. I've seen examples of people who turned a dry room into a multi-tier flower room and didn't change the HVAC system at all, and they struggled.
Well, I like that number one, right? Air distribution is obviously what we're talking about here, and both Pipp Horticulture and GrowGlide have in-rack airflow solutions to sort of solve for this problem. And because it's been a problem historically, how do we deliver velocities of air that are conditioned and CO2 rich directly to the plants at the right place for the length of a run? I really like that number 2 came up though too, as far as air filtration. A lot of people that go ahead. I was gonna say, a lot of people that I talk to that have been in operation for a significant amount of time, at first, the initial design phase didn't really highly consider air filtration. And then pathogen pressures started to build, and it became, how do we solve it now? And I think there are ways that you can add filtration inline in duct or in the room, but they do all compromise airflow in certain ways. So again, from a facility design perspective, consider it early. And even if you don't do it, consider it,
I think, it's interesting. Both of us are growers for a long time, and we grew during, the black market, and when there really were no rules and regulations, and when lab testing hit and we had to step our game up. I think that's why you and I both were drawn towards HVAC and airflows. We realized it was the best IPM tool that you can have as a grower today. With a good airflow, air filtration, and management of your mechanical system, that is your best tool when fighting pests and pathogens in this facility. I find it interesting that HEPA is brought up. That's such a common thing I see in these grow room discussions, that's like low-hanging fruit. Oh, you got to use a HEPA filter. But realistically, using a HEPA filter in a grow is not required. And if anything, is just super inefficient. They're so thick in terms of how much they restrict airflow that you typically have to increase the fan motor on your HVAC system to overcome that resistance, which drives your electrical costs up significantly. And for what benefit? And so plus they're so dense and fibrous that the high humidity environment, a lot of mold and pathogens will grow in HEPA filters, which kind of defeats the purpose. And so I actually don't recommend using HEPA, at least in your ductwork, maybe as an air scrubber, but air filtration in general, like an active killing technology, something like UVC or PCO in the ductwork is essential. It's also interesting on number one, if you see, they recommend horizontal and vertical airflow. Well, they're saying alternatively a vertical airflow configuration. So for people listening, horizontal airflow or HAF fans is the strategy that's developed in greenhouse design, basically to create a big circular movement of air. Not a single pass, but the concept is you just need enough energy to get the air moving in a predictable pattern, and it takes a really low amount of energy to keep it kicking it along in that pattern. And that same strategy works really good for single tier. It doesn't work as good for multi-tier. You have to take a different approach. Instead of a circular airflow within a room, it really does make sense to kind of take that circle and flip it on its head. So you're now single passing air through the racks in every tier, entering your return ductwork, circulating back through your HVAC system, and then supplying in the front. So it's circle just flipped on its side.
This episode is brought to you by Access, provided by Pipp and GrowGlide. Access to your plants on the second tier or access to harvest on your third tier, but also access to operational efficiency, better working conditions, and higher profits. Access to consistent success for your cultivation business. We could all use better access to success sometimes, but when it comes to multi-tier cannabis cultivation, you need to get up to get down. And you need the support, space, and safety provided by purpose-built access solutions to get the job done right. With the Elevate system from Pipp and GrowDecks from GrowGlide, you have two of the best options in the industry to choose from. Just slide or clip the decks into place and know you have empowered your team with a safe solution to reach new heights. Contact Pipp or GrowGlide to learn more about purpose-built decking for multi-tier cultivation.
The next thing I want to get to is airflow crop steering, because me throwing terms around that piss people off that maybe don't fully capture the science of it. But I think it allows us to unpack this concept of, what is airflow crop steering for indoor cannabis cultivation. Obviously, we know crop steering is controlled stresses. And what we're really talking about is manipulating airflow in a myriad of different ways in the space to get predictable results. And sometimes it's about cooling the plant, sometimes about triggering senescence, sometimes it's about removing moisture, eliminating microclimates. There's a number of different factors here. Maybe it's even about controlling drybacks or controlling root zone temperature. But the idea being that we both know the importance of airflow. And I want to unpack a little bit about the opportunities that are presented by augmented airflow in rack, and maybe how we can overcome obstacles, and empowering cultivators to use that tool more. Because historically, we've all just said, absolutely, bring in outside air. Outside air is my best friend. My HVAC isn't keeping up. But now we're in a more scientific, deliverable, data-driven, and measurable cultivation facility. How do we use it now?
Yeah, airflow is fascinating to me. I love this topic. And to me, I think of air, when we talk about like the parameters of plant growth, I think of airflow as sort of the equalizer amongst all of if you think about like sound production or music production, airflow is kind of the EQ. It balances all of the other parameters together and ties it together. And it's pivotal. I mean, there's studies in other crops that show airflow alone, just increasing airflow to certain rates can drastically increase photosynthetic rate, also transpiration rate, and result in higher biomass yields at the end of the day.
And we've both seen it in real world applications in real facilities. Yeah.
I mean, I'm on a kind of a mission here at Pipp to quantify airflow better. I think we've all heard the term leaves dancing, or we hear people say not enough airflow or too much airflow. And to me, that is kind of one of the last, I kind of correlate that leaves dancing comment similar to the snap in the dry cure room. Oh, it's not snapping right, or oh, my leaves aren't dancing right. Well, the dry room has already been tackled. People are using water activity, moisture content to quantify that snap, crackle, pop of a dry room, right? And I'm really passionate about trying to do the same thing for airflow in these spaces, using the right sensor to measure it and quantify it, and then knowing what to do with that information to balance the energy balance of the room. It's really cool. There's a whole kind of a field of study called environmental biophysics. And it is a field of study to measure the thermodynamics and energy balance within a crop environment, whether it's outdoors or indoors. And there's formulas you can run to quantify exactly how much airflow you need given the right light intensity, temperature, relative humidity. You plug in all these parameters and you can actually solve for how many meters per second or feet per minute of airflow I need in my canopy to balance the equation. It's really fascinating. I love it. And so to give you a quick little, or never mind, I'll stop. I could keep talking all day about airflow.
No, I was just going to say, like, you know, and this is the fun part of it, is that it's a balance, and there's an equation that you can use to influence more informed decision making and allocation of capital, right? Like number 5, CO2 assimilation. You and I have talked about this for hours, right? What velocities do we truly need to break the boundary layer and drive CO2 assimilation from a bottom-up perspective? Is it 0.4 meters per second? Is it 0.7 meters per second? What happens at a higher ppfd with the appropriate water in the media? Can we do more, right? And no one really knows the answer to that. But like you said, there's an equation that helps you balance it out and find parameters of success, guide rails of success, if you will, where you say, if this, then this will be successful, versus I think that's enough airflow for this plant, right? Or they're dancing or they're praying. It's like, I appreciate that legacy comment, but it doesn't inform a systems manager or an allocation of financial resources.
Well, yeah, it's almost like airflow to a lot of growers is an afterthought. You know, you just got to have some, but it's really an important tool that I think is being underutilized. I like you bringing it to the attention by kind of coining that term airflow crop steering, which is applicable. Crop steering is a broad term. It can be used in a number of different ways, and you can kind of think of a lot of different things growers do on a day-to-day basis as crop steering. And airflow absolutely is a tool used to manipulate plant response and influence the boundary layer, like vegetative crop steering, for example. You could argue a slightly lower airspeed through the canopy would be a vegetative cue, because you build a larger boundary layer around the stomates or stomata, basically reducing the stress and the water demand on the plant. So that means the transpiration would be slower, they'll be drinking less water, and the osmotic pressure will be, I think, lower.
You know, number 4 jumps out to me
pretty
too.
cool.
Like, number 4 in VPD, right? Like airflow definitely directly impacts the way we think about using vapor pressure deficit as a tool, because it can help with cooling the leaf surface, and it can do a lot to influence the physical data results that we get in the space. I know, to me, I use airflow as a tool to lower the leaf temperature in order to run a higher ambient condition with my HVAC if I don't have enough performance capacity, or I'm finding a way to bridge the gap. Our conversations on vapor pressure deficit were enlightening to me, Durs, and I always appreciate you breaking it down on a scientific level and helping me utilize this tool more. Can you maybe talk a little bit about this? Because I think it's a big combination of knowledge needed to how do you utilize airflow to manipulate or better utilize VPD as a tool to increase plant vitality and phenotypic expression and performance of that plant in the space?
That's a great question. Well, I'm not going to dive into breakdown and give you a definition of VPD. I assume that whoever's listening to this is pretty familiar with the concept. But there's a few things around airflow and VPD that I do find useful and pretty interesting that growers can use in their garden today. I always recommend getting an infrared thermometer, an IR temperature gun. The one I use, I'm not sponsored by the company or whatever, but I use a Fluke 62 Max. I found that to be useful. And the main reason being is it has adjustable emissivity settings. If you go buy an IR gun to measure leaf temperature from Home Depot, that tool is calibrated to measure drywall. And so getting one with an emissivity adjustment, which is a scale of 0 to 1.0, you can calibrate it for leaf surface temperature to get a more accurate reading. I had a grower do this in Oregon like 3 weeks ago. They used a Home Depot IR gun. I said, measure leaf temperature in your room. And then I said, well, which one are you using? They bought the one that I recommended, and they found a difference of almost 8 degrees in their measurements using the right IR thermometer. And so that means you could be way off on your VPD calculations and where you think you are in terms of your photosynthetic rate. But
why not a FLIR camera? Why not an infrared camera that gives you this wonderful visual layout of this is hot and this is cold in the space?
you absolutely can. I think it's cost driven for the most part. I think a $60 to $100 IR thermometer is more usable at the end of the day. And so anyways, yeah, it's a great tool to also understand your microclimates and your environmental control. That's how we did it in this room. The grower took 6 measurements per 4x8 table across both tiers in a space, and we're able to effectively map out his hot and cold spots, change the sensor locations and fan locations throughout the room, and homogenize the room a lot better just off the basis of leaf temperature. It's almost a corollary to airflow, because what you'll see is in areas of higher airflow, higher wind speeds, you will see a cooler overall leaf temperature. And as the airflow is decreased, you will see a warmer average air temperature because the plant is not able to evaporatively cool itself via transpiration. And so measuring leaf temperature is more than just understanding photosynthesis and vapor pressure deficit. It's an important diagnostic tool into understanding the biochemistry, what's happening in that leaf. It's my favorite metric in terms of plant growing.
I think there's a ton of great information here that we can continue to unpack. I want to ask the GrowBot another question, though, that is sort of tying this in, right? Oh, Will's got another one here. But to me, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask a follow-up question. What's the optimal air velocity in a cannabis CEA for optimal plant health and growth? Just see what it said, see if it matches up with what you guys know here.
1.5 to 3 meters per second, Durs. What are you thinking?
So
it depends.
So
top down versus bottom up, right?
So that's a higher overall range than what is typically purported or what most people theorize. So the general rule of thumb for airflow in greenhouse manuals and design for most crops is between 0.5 and 1 meters per second. So I am in the boat that cannabis can take higher wind velocities just because of the higher transpiration rates. And so basically as PPFD or light intensity increases, you're going to have to scale your wind speed as well. And I think if anything, 3 meters per second is the way upper end. So a range that I would be thinking is between 0.5 and around 2 to 2.5. And so, and feet per second is a weird metric. Feet per minute is more commonly used, meters per second and feet per minute. But in feet per minute, that's basically 100 to about 400 feet per minute. And so in vegetative phase, you're looking more in the 0.5 to 1 meters per second. And in flower, you're looking upwards of 1.0 and beyond. So around 300 feet per minute. Of course, that's a general range. It varies depending on your PPFD. But that's a really good a really good reason to why you need to keep up with your canopy management, defoliation, light penetration, because you won't get that level of airflow if you don't. And your room design, space utilization, racking layout, everything we've been talking about thus far comes back to that, getting that metric into those ranges.
I think you brought up some really good information on, curing and using water activity and moisture content and understanding the process of curing and the parameters for success. I'm curious here on, let's ask the GrowBot the importance of airflow in the curing space, right? We understand dehumidification. I think plant spacing is a big one. I think that emissivity adjusted IR gun is also really important to understand product temperature relative to ambient. I think we've talked about this a little bit too. Maybe VPD isn't the right thing to be talking about here. But I do think airflow can be tremendously powerful when utilized in the curing space. And we've seen that through CFD modeling, through real world application, and through the difference between front of the room, back of the room, bottom of the room, top of the room, just like mobile racking and growing plants, right?
Yeah, I'm interested in what it says. I mean, the
Me too.
big debate we always hear in dry rooms with airflow is there's a common consensus people like indirect airflow. So more of a sucking type airflow than a blowing type airflow. So pointing fans at the ceiling above your racks and above your plants to draw air up through the canopy versus turning those fans up, facing down, blowing air onto the canopy. And I don't know. I don't know the right answer to it, but I tend to have had good success with indirect airflow in dry cure room.
I mean, how hard is it to get really good airflow in a curing space, right? We have these walls of drying cannabis and we're trying to blow air through them. You and I have talked about this, not even from a sciencey perspective. How do you just get air in between the layers? Do you bring it bottom up? Well, now do we bring all these pathogens and crap from the floor that we're blowing up into our plants? Do we go top down? Does that create short cycling? Does that create stagnant spaces, right? So I like this idea of just, for me, it's always been more air, the better, direct or indirect. Let me adjust as I go, but I need air in that space in order to facilitate water as the taxi cab in the curing process, right?
Yeah, totally. That is moisture control. Number one is absolutely the name of the game, right? So as the moisture is removed from the product, airflow is going to help it be removed from the room. So it's not left in the space, driving the space humidity up. Temperature regulation as well. It will create a homogeneous environment for the room to dry evenly. That's a big thing. It's just keeping an even room so that everything dries the same rate, and airflow is that equalizer, to help do that.
What do you think the right product temperature is for the first 3 days of curing? Ask the GrowBot. What's the right product temperature for the first 3 days of the curing process in cannabis? And I know there's no right answer here, right? I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Durs. I'm just saying this is a conversation I've had a lot.
I'm thinking about it,
because I got an answer in my head, and I don't know if it's the right answer, but I definitely steer people to not be so afraid of a cooler temperature or a warmer temperature, as long as we have consistency. Well, then we know what to play over the course of time, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there is a right answer. So right product temperature can range from 60 and 70 degrees. Yeah, I think that's generally a good range. Above 70, there's definitely a risk of starting to lose some of those lighter monoterpenes, those lower boiling point terpenoids and flavonoids.
And I think something that I really want to call out here is that there's a difference between product temperature and ambient temperature. And that's where the airflow comes into play too. We have this moist product that's migrating moisture away, and we blow air past it, just like sweating outside in the wind, we get cooled. So thinking that we need a 58-degree temperature in the space is probably tied to a 58-degree product temperature that we might be able to achieve at a much warmer ambient condition with the appropriate airflow. So again, back to that emissivity adjusted IR gun, know the tools, know how to use them, and that'll actually allow you to better utilize the mechanical solutions that you have purpose-built and developed for the curing space.
Totally. And probably the ideal product temperature changes based on how much capacity you have and how much wet weight you have in the room. Temperature is like your throttle for moisture removal in a dry room. So the colder you run your room, the less moisture removal rate your mechanical system will have. It's harder to remove water from the air at colder temperatures. So as you, even just a few degrees warmer, let's say you're drying at the standard 60-60, drying at 65-60 is going to greatly increase your moisture removal rate of your room and change the product temperature. So I think a range of 60 to 70 is appropriate because it's a tool. There's no one right answer, like you said. So it's interesting.
And I think again, back to the consistency, like there's probably a couple of different ways to have success depending on how you measure success as a cannabis brand and cultivation facility and the SOPs that you can implement and adhere. It really is to me about consistency, right? As a consumer, I want to get that product as possible each time I go in. That's why I'm willing to spend my money and commit to a brand. And sometimes I see a wide variety of results in the space, right? One run of this might be great. The next run, maybe not so hot. Sometimes it's outside ambient that's influencing it. it's a failure of compressors, it's an improper load in, it's improper spacing, number of different factors come into play. Again, it's about using those tools and understanding how to react when things fall out of place to get them back on track.
Yeah. Well, yeah, those are all great points. And I think another thing too for the dry cure spaces is not having it be a bottleneck for your process or an afterthought in your facility design like it so commonly is. How many facilities have we been to where the drying rooms are undersized either from a space perspective or a dehumidification capacity perspective? And it basically halts the whole rest of your process throughout your facility and can really slow it down, everything. And it's tricky to size dry rooms the right way because there's so much variability in how people like to harvest and hang their plants. So it can be a challenging kind of like veg space to flower ratio. That's a pretty easy problem. There are some really good general best practices to know if I have this much flowering canopy, I need this much veg space to accommodate that plant rotation. There's no such general rule for flower square footage or canopy to cubic footage required in a dry room. It's a tough one. And so I think that's where people, kind of miss the mark all the times and they have the wrong cubic footage to house their plants. It can be a challenge. So going vertically, having mobile racks and things you can easily access and adjust is the way to go.
I know that we've got another 15 minutes or so here slated, man. What kind of questions do you have for the GrowBoters? I know that, you might be able to stump this puppy as well, but I'm curious. What do you want to throw at this thing?
Good question.
What about the topic of, measuring airflow? I mean, that's kind of one of your objectives, right? How do you quantify that?
Why do anemometers suck?
And anything to do with that? Yeah.
Should I ask him like a super technical? I want to try and
yes,
it?
absolutely.
Sure, anything, man. Let's go.
Okay. Are uni or omnidirectional hot wire anemometers better for measuring airflow in controlled environment horticulture?
You're gonna have to spell the anemometer.
hot dash wire.
Are uni omnidirectional? How do you
hot wire anemometer?
Anemometer. Is that right?
Yeah, close enough.
Okay.
Hot wire anemometer. Are uni or omnidirectional hot wire anemometers better for measuring airflow in cultivation?
Oh, you're about to be out of a job if this thing slams home the answer, man.
Here we go.
Well, it depends. It's going to depend on these 4 factors.
No way.
Anemometer. Okay. Depends on your specific needs.
Oh, I stumped it. It's wrong. It's wrong. No, actually, this is actually a really good answer. This is crazy. Can you copy and paste this one for me too? Yeah,
Okay.
so this is an interesting topic. We talk about like
okay.
to measure airflow. It's something I've gotten like really into recently. This is the traditional hot wire anemometer. They also have more classical vane type anemometers for measuring with a fan. A hot wire has these little probes in them. If you can see that, probably not, but it's a little bulb with a voltage going to it. And as airflow grows across this hot wire, it cools the wire and more voltage is required to maintain the temperature. And that difference in voltage is translated to an air velocity. So it's a much better tool for measuring airflow at low velocities or within ductwork. And so this is something I learned is I knew that hot wires were a better tool than vane anemometers. I wasn't aware of uni or omnidirectional hot wires till recently. Everyone uses these because they're commonly available for HVAC technicians. But what I found is that measuring airflow in a canopy with a unidirectional hot wire is really challenging because air is not coming from one direction onto a canopy. It's a very turbulent zone. So omnidirectional ones have a bulb at the top without a shroud and can measure air all around it. And so you put it vertically in the canopy and you can get much more accurate air measurements at low velocities with an omnidirectional hot wire. They're not cheap, unfortunately. They're hard to find too. There's not many of them out there. But I think in the future, when airflow measurements are integrated into these cloud automation and control suites, they'll be using an omnidirectional hot wire at some point. They're really cool. I've done some testing with them and got some really good data.
This is, thank you, Durs. I appreciate this. Like, you show a little bit of the tool belt that you use to serve this industry and grow your own personal knowledge and drive everybody forward. I'm curious, like, I know this is your new toy. Is this your favorite currently? I remember when we were getting into water activity meters and a number of different tools that really helped us educate ourselves on the decision-making process, again, the allocation of labor, mental resources, financial resources. Is there a particular tool that you covet more than anything else in the space? Would it be your emissivity adjustable IR gun? Would it, what tool do you think is most important? Ask the GrowBot. What's the most important tool in cannabis cultivation?
Oh, man. I mean, I would say there's probably two. I think there'd be one to understand the root zone and one to understand the climate, probably. But it's a tough one to answer. Selfishly, my favorite tool is an IR, emissivity adjusted IR gun, just because I find leaf temperature to be such a valuable metric that's often misunderstood or not measured. More recently, it's these airflow measuring devices because I really want to hone in on that specific parameter. But there's so many. I mean, arguably a quantum sensor to measure PPFD is probably the best one. You know,
didn't even mention your Lycor device, man. I thought you'd be throwing the Lycor around, dude.
I mean, Lycor devices, for people who aren't familiar, it's a tool manufactured by a company called Lycor. There's a lot of models of them, but they're used to measure photosynthesis, and they're basically like a miniature horticulture research laboratory in one tool. They're found in academic research laboratories for horticulture, and they're awesome, but they're probably not practical to use on a day-to-day basis for most cultivators, and more than likely overkill for most cultivators today.
Great point on practicality, man. I mean, that's why I fell in love with an emissivity adjustable IR gun. I feel like it can tell you so much in that moment that can immediately lead to an informed action plan that triggers plant health. You and I have been in facilities together. I know you know what I'm talking about, where we've walked in, we've used the IR gun, we've effectively determined where the VPD is at, we've changed set points from an integrated HVAC perspective, and within hours, watch the plant health change in a measurable way. And to me, that was an eye-opener of like, dude, this is a simple tool that's changing this whole facility and making it millions of dollars more.
And it cut their veg time in half. Remember that? That was awesome. That's a good answer, actually.
Yeah, so
high quality digital hygrometer.
Yeah, I asked it said, a comprehensive environmental monitoring. Okay, and I said, try again and give me one single tool. That was the hygrometer.
That's not a bad answer. I mean, leaf temperature measurements, you get one metric, right? But to calculate VPD, you still need to know the climate, so the temperature and relative humidity. A hygrometer will give you that. Humidity is an important one, but it's interesting it shows humidity. Definitely not the most important thing, if you had to pick one, but it is pretty crucial. I think of temperature and humidity affecting plants in two different ways. Temperature is going to impact photosynthetic rate more, and humidity is going to impact the opening or closing of stomata, and therefore transpiration more. So I guess the GrowBot wants to prioritize transpiration, which I'm okay with. I like transpiration.
Definitely gets the wheels turning, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting they chose that. Yeah, interesting. There's some cool tools coming out with like terms of AI, machine learning, for vertical farming. And did I steal it? My bad, dude. We're on the same wavelength.
Huh? No, this is great. It doesn't know anyone important in the cannabis space, but to speak to the automation thing, it's something that I struggle with, right? At what point is automation a tool that empowers more informed decisions? And at what point does granular data send you into the tar pit, right? Like collecting data even sometimes inaccurate data might lead to disastrous decision making. So for you, I know you spend a lot of time in cultivation facilities talking to cultivators. How do you go about validating that data? You and I have both done this consultative approach from afar where it's like, hey, go collect this information. And with that information, we can sit down and have a 30-minute to an hour-long call and really make some good decisions with that data. But how do you validate it, right? Do you just take a look at the screen and say, that's what you're working with? Or do you double check? Or I'm curious your perspective on that. And maybe GrowBots too. Like, how do you validate environmental sensor data in a cannabis cultivation space?
Yeah. Trial and error has kind of got me into like a sort of SOP of how I do this with growers. But I actually don't even look at data from anything until I understand how it was measured and tracked and what tool they used. Because oftentimes data can be really misleading and lead you down the wrong path. You know, the whole point of data collection and analysis is to make informed decisions faster so that I can spend more time with my plants and more time with my staff to reduce my labor costs and be efficient. And so many times I've spent time looking at this data, realizing that it was captured incorrectly. Either the sensor that was used was the wrong type of sensor, it wasn't calibrated, or it was in the wrong location, not measuring and capturing what it really needed to, that would be useful information. Or the data is being skewed by some other biotic or abiotic factor. So a thing like, you know, don't put your climate sensor right next to a fan because you're not going to get a good reading. I've seen that. I saw that in a drying room somewhat recently where people were like, oh my gosh, my relative humidity is so low and it's like so cold in this room. Well, it was literally had a fan blowing right into the intake of the sensor. So I was like, they were freaking out. I said, don't freak out. Let's go take a picture of this sensor and send it to me. And lo and behold, that was the problem. They moved the sensor and the room was just fine, right? So that's kind of what I do is you always got to kind of go through and question everything, you know, the scientific method, like everything. It's don't trust any data until you can validate it. And that, oh, wow, look at this. Cross-checking, redundancy, sensor placement. Gosh, these GrowBots reading my brain.
I think you nailed it. Your immediate response was, even when you're working with customers or potential customers, it's about an SOP that you exercise to empower both of you or the group to make a more informed decision. And that's what I think about using the data for too. How do I take this data and build better SOPs in my facility? And it's not always this alarm went off, go shut off the HVAC, or this alarm went off, change everything. It's this alarm went off, assess the situation. Go through this checklist to make sure that this is truly a devastating potential fail point, or it's just an outlier that we need to start using as sort of a guide to the other bigger problem, perhaps.
Yeah. Number 7's a good point there. Verify against external sources. I love that. I actually don't see a whole lot of growers doing that when I go to these on-site visits. Is they have hardwired climate root zone sensors, you know, CO2, temp, RH, all these different things, and they trust them, you know, like, which, you know, I don't blame them for doing that, but trust but verify. And so that's why I always recommend getting a set of high quality handheld tools to place side by side against your hardwired continually logging ones to validate. And yeah, it's an added expense, but you're banking a lot of your crop success off of this information. You gotta make sure it's right. So yeah, I always recommend doing that. When I go to facilities, I oftentimes hang my sensors next to the other sensors in the room just to make sure that they're accurate and collecting the right data. That's a good one though. Yeah, it's crazy to me. It's so awesome to see how technologically advanced these grows are getting in terms of the data that's being captured. It's helping the industry move forward as a whole, but it's also interesting to see how further developments in this, or I guess what's the right way to put this, a lot of data is being collected, but growers are so busy on a day-to-day basis, they have a hard time analyzing all of it because it's so much information. And I think that's the value of AI and machine learning in the future, is being able to help the growers analyze and identify outliers in their data so they don't have to spend a ton of time looking at it. Collecting a lot of data, but analyzing it a lot faster.
I think you nailed it. There's this technological advancements that we're applying to the cultivation facilities and getting this granular data that's making facilities better, but the lag is 7 days a week, hands in the dirt cultivator, myself included, legacy transitioning to commercial science-based decision making. How do you learn these tools? How do you build the SOPs for the rest of your team? For me, it was a pain point assessment, right? Go out and spend a lot of money on these tools. You're gonna learn how to use them because you came out of pocket, and you need to use them because you're trying to solve a problem. When the tools become afterthoughts, so do the SOPs, so does the data, so does the decision-making process. And I think that's where we need to catch up, right? Cultivators, cultivation directors, system operators really need to make sure that we have these SOPs written down for scalability, for career opportunities for lower level employees to jump into those situations and be successful, and to make sure that we're using these tools appropriately versus just shooting an IR gun all over the place, right? Be systematic about it. So it's just a better information all around.
Yeah. And it helps to learn Excel. I hate to say it.
Yeah.
It's a good tool to know.
Yeah.
Oh man.
You know, I think about the way we're interacting with ChatGPT right now in a conversational manner. I mean, eventually you'll be able just to chat with your grow facility, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, how are my plants doing? How, you know, give me a rundown of how my plants are doing today. Gives you a little rundown. What can I do to fix this? Like, have this natural language conversation with your grow facility. Kind of, it reminds me of kind of like, you know, Jarvis from Iron Man, let's say, right? It's Jarvis for your grow facility, where you just interact with it in a natural conversational way. And that's, I mean, that speaks to, I mean, because we are gathering all this data, and the bottleneck is the analyzing all of that, right? And you know, having, you know, taking action on that data. So I think definitely AI and these tools like these language models are they're gonna start showing up in these tools, you know, as for crop steering and, you know, and monitoring for sure.
Totally. I completely agree.
Yeah.
It's interesting though too. It's like, to be able to automate this process and utilize AI, the hardware technology has to catch up with it too. Because right now, I think a lot of the sensors in grow rooms, I don't trust to make control decisions. I trust to make monitoring, you know, to monitor, but it's a different thing between using a sensor to monitor something and control something.
Yeah.
So if you give these sensors autonomy, then sensor placement, density, maintenance, calibration, all these points on the screen are pivotal to trusting this automation to do the right tools, because it doesn't know if the sensor's in the right place. It's just gonna, you know, take the data and trust it. So it's up to us. That's probably going to be our growers' job, is making sure the grow brain is being fed the right info, basically.
Yeah, it's like the old thing, like garbage in, garbage out, right?
Yeah.
It's only as good as the data it collects.
Fire in, fire out, right?
Oh, yeah, man. You know, I have to say this GrowBot and the responses that it's generating is kind of mind-blowing. I know, Jesse, you and me too, just for how many years we've been in this industry and how long we've been hungry for information. 10, 15 years ago, if this tool existed, the information would not have been available for it to pull from on the internet and books or whatever. And it's just I think this right here is really impressive to me. It's a testament to how far the cannabis industry has come as a whole. I mean, in my teenage years, I spent thousands of hours digging through IC Mag, THC Farmer, you know, all these online forums. And I, 9 times out of 10, did not find the answer I was looking for. And there were no other resources, you know, to really learn about specifically for cannabis. And I think that's what drove a lot of us early cannabis, you know, passionate growers, just hungry for information. And we still have it today. You know, people who are interested in entering the cannabis space today, I mentor a few college students now who are like pursuing a career in cannabis. And I just think, God, they're so spoiled, because, you know, like, the amount of PDFs on very niche, highly technical cannabis topics you can download on the internet today, I would have given anything for that information when I was 14, 15 years old. And so it's this whole podcast and this whole topic and method is like just a testament to how far the industry's come, really.
Man, I think you nailed it. That pretty much eats up the hour, Durs, but we appreciate you coming on. This was a great episode, man. We dove into racking, room utilization, what influences quality, quantity, consistency, and operational efficiency, airflow crop steering, unpacking that a little bit, influencing VPD and the mechanical solutions in the space. Man, we could spend another couple of hours really talking about this, like I knew we could. But again, I appreciate you coming on and bringing your perspective. There are even a couple opportunities in there where we caught the GrowBot in some ignorance, whether it's nutrient film technique or airflow that was maybe a little too high that might cause detriment to plant health. So I think in a lot of ways, like you mentioned just a second ago, it used to be secret sauce. Now it's not quite so secret. The recipe's out there. You can tweak it and make it your own. You can make it spicy. You can keep it simple. But the idea is that there's information out there that we can validate that help make more informed decisions, so cultivators and facilities can make a little bit more money tomorrow than they're making today. So again, I appreciate you coming on and diving into these topics, man. And just appreciate you being a friend and a colleague and a peer and a resource in the space, buddy.
It's been a pleasure. And just thank you again for having me, Jesse and Wil. And Jesse, it's always fun chatting with you, buddy. Much love.
My pleasure, buddy.
Thanks, Anders.
Yeah, thanks, Wil.